Tonight, picture a clear night over England in the last spring of the old world. It is the year 1066, and the fields lie quiet under a wide dark sky, the barley just beginning to green, the rivers running low and cold between their banks. And then, one evening near the end of April, the people of England look up and see a thing they have never seen before. A star with a long tail of pale fire hangs in the western sky after sundown, low over the hills, burning night after night for a week and more, brighter than any lamp, brighter than any candle, a smear of cold light that will not go away. Shepherds see it from the downs, fishermen see it from their boats, monks come out from their cloisters to stand in the dark and watch it, and some of them write it down in careful ink, that in this year a comet was seen such as no man then living had ever beheld, and that the whole country was afraid. They did not know what it was. They did not know that it was only a great ball of ice and dust that swings past the sun every 76 years, indifferent to kings and kingdoms, and that it would come again long after every soul then breathing had turned to dust. They only knew that a burning sign had appeared in the heavens, and that such signs, in the old belief, came before the fall of great men and the changing of great things. And they were right, though not in the way they feared. Because this was the year that England, the England that had grown slowly over 6 long centuries, the England of Saxon kings and timber halls and quiet green shires, was about to end. Not slowly. Not gently. In the space of a single autumn afternoon, on a low ridge near the southern coast, everything would change, and a new people and a new tongue and a new order would come down upon this land and press it into a shape it has, in some deep way, held ever since. Tonight we are going to tell that whole story, slowly and softly, from long before the comet to long after the dust had settled, the entire story of the year that remade England. And we are going to tell it at the pace of a slow breath, so that somewhere in the long, unhurried middle of it, you will drift away and not hear the end. So settle now, settle into whatever stillness you have managed to make for yourself tonight. Let the lamp grow dim, or let the screen fade low, and let the small weight of the whole day slip down from your shoulders, one quiet inch at a time. There is nothing left tonight that needs doing. There is nothing here that needs deciding. There is only a long old story, and a calm voice to carry it, and the slow turning of the years. If you find that you enjoy these quiet histories, that they help you let go of the day and sink towards sleep, then you might gently like this video, or follow along, but only if you truly enjoy what I make here, only if it genuinely helps. And if you feel like it, leave your town and your local time down in the comments before you drift off, because it quietly helps other sleepless people find their way to this small calm corner of the night. And there is something companionable in knowing that all across the dark world, in 100 different time zones, other people are lying awake and then, one by one, letting go. Take a slow breath in, let it out even more slowly, and let us go back, gently, to the beginning, to an England that did not yet know it was living in its final year. To understand what was lost in 1066, we have to begin before it, and before it, and before it again, until we come to a country that had already been a country for a very long time. Because there was an England before the Normans came, a whole living kingdom with its own kings and laws and songs, and it did not appear out of nothing. Go back 600 years from our comet, to the years after the Romans left, when the last of the legions sailed away from Britain, and the great stone roads began, slowly to crack and grass over. Into that emptied province came peoples from across the North Sea, from the coasts of what is now Denmark and northern Germany, and the flat lands by the sea, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. In their long open boats, and over the generations they spread across the lowlands of Britain, pushing the older British peoples west into the hills of Wales and Cornwall, and north into the moors, and they brought with them their language, an early rough form of English, and their gods, and their way of living in timber halls gathered around a central fire. For a long time there was no single England at all, only a scattering of small warring kingdoms, with names that still echo in the map today: Kent and Sussex and Essex and Wessex, Mercia in the Middle Lands, Northumbria in the north, each with its own royal line, each rising and falling, swallowing its neighbours and being swallowed in turn. Slowly, over centuries, the idea of a single people took shape. One folk who spoke one tongue and were beginning to think of themselves as the English, even while they were still ruled by different kings. And into this slowly gathering world came a shock from the sea. In the last years of the 8th century, out of the north, came the first Viking raiders, Norsemen from Norway and Denmark, in their swift dragon-prowed ships, falling first upon the undefended monasteries of the coast, upon the holy island of Lindisfarne in the year 793, where they killed the monks and carried off the gold and left the chroniclers to write in horror that never before had such a terror appeared in Britain, and what began as raiding became, over the following century, invasion and settlement. Great Viking armies came and did not leave. They carved out a huge territory across the east and north of England, a region that came to be called the Danelaw, where Danish law ran and Danish speech was heard and Danish farmers settled the land, and their words sank so deep into English that we still use them every day without knowing it. The sky above us, and the eggs on our plate, and the very word they for other people, all of it quietly Norse. Kingdom after English kingdom fell before them, until it seemed that the whole island might become a Viking land. And here, in the darkest hour, we meet the one Saxon king whose name most people still know, the only English king ever to be called the Great, Alfred, King of Wessex, the last kingdom left standing. Alfred was a scholar as much as a soldier, a quiet, sickly, thoughtful man who would far rather have read books than fought battles, and who nonetheless found himself, in the depths of one bitter winter, hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a handful of followers while the Danes overran his kingdom. From that low point, from the reeds and the mud and the grey water, he gathered his strength, and he came back, and he beat the great Danish army in the field, and then, instead of driving every Dane into the sea, he did something wiser and stranger. He made a peace, and he drew a line across the map, and he set about building something that would outlast him. A system of fortified towns, of learning, of law, of a navy, of an idea. He did not free all of England, but he saved the notion of an English kingdom, and he passed it to his children and grandchildren, and it was they, over the next 2 generations, who pushed the frontier north and east, town by town and shire by shire, until at last, under Alfred's grandson, a single king could truthfully call himself king of all the English, ruler of one kingdom stretching from the Channel to the Scottish border. That kingdom, the Kingdom of England, was barely 140 years old when our comet burned in the sky. It was young, as kingdoms go, and it had been made and unmade and made again, and it carried inside it, like layers of soil, the Britons and the Saxons and the Danes, all pressed together, all becoming, slowly, one people. Hold that in your mind as you drift, this green patchwork country of shires and timber and slow rivers, this England that had survived so much, and thought, perhaps, that it had survived the worst, because it had not survived the worst, not yet. The peace that Alfred's line had built held for the better part of a century, a long golden stretch in which England grew rich and orderly, its towns busy, its coins the finest in the north of Europe, its churches full of song, its kings crowned with holy oil in a ceremony that made them, in the eyes of their people, something more than mere warlords. But wealth is a lamp in a dark room, and out across the North Sea, other eyes were watching. In the last years of the 10th century, a second great age of Viking raiding began, and this time it fell upon a kingdom ruled by a man whose very name has become a byword for weakness, Aethelred, called the Unready. Though the old word did not mean unprepared so much as ill-advised, badly counselled. A king who never seemed able to choose the right course or the right men. Year after year the Danish fleets came, and year after year Aethelred, unable to beat them, tried to buy them off, gathering enormous sums of silver from his groaning people, the tax that came to be called the Danegeld, and handing it over to the raiders in the hope that they would sail away. And they did sail away with the silver, and then they came back the next year for more. Because that is what happens when you pay men to leave. A lesson that seems obvious, and yet has needed relearning in every century since. The silver of England drained across the sea into Scandinavian hoards, so much of it that to this day English coins of Aethelred's reign are dug out of the Baltic soil by the thousand. More of them found in Sweden than in England itself. And still the raiders came, and at last one of them, Sven Forkbeard, King of Denmark, decided that he would stop merely robbing England and simply take it. And in the year 1013 he did, driving Aethelred into exile across the Channel, only to die a few weeks later, so suddenly that the conquest nearly came apart in his hands. But Sven had a son, a young man of extraordinary ability, and his name was Cnut, and it is with Cnut that the story bends toward the shape it would finally take. Cnut fought his way back to the throne, and by the year 1016 he was king of all England, a Danish king ruling the English, and rather than crush the country he had won, he chose to rule it well. He kept the English laws. He kept the English church. He married Ethelred's widow, a Norman-born noblewoman named Emma, tying himself to the old line. He divided the kingdom into great earldoms and set powerful men over them, and he spent his reign holding together a sprawling empire that stretched across the sea to Denmark and Norway, a North Sea empire with England as its richest jewel. It is Cnut, by the way, who gives us one of the oldest and most misunderstood stories in English history, the tale of the king who set his throne on the beach and commanded the tide to stop and was ignored by the sea. People tell it now as though he were a fool who thought he could hold back the waves, when the whole point, in the version the monks first wrote down, was the opposite, that Cnut set up the demonstration deliberately in front of his flattering courtiers, precisely to prove to them that a king's power is nothing beside the power of God and nature, and that they should stop telling him he was almighty. He got his feet wet on purpose, to make a point about humility, which is a rather more interesting thing to do with an afternoon than most kings manage. But Cnut, for all his skill, was mortal, and when he died his great empire fell apart among his quarrelling sons, who ruled briefly and badly and then died young, one after another, until the Danish lines simply ran out. And so the crown of England, having passed to the Danes and back again through blood and silver, came to rest, in the year 1042, on the head of a man who had spent almost his whole life waiting for it in a foreign country. His name was Edward, and history remembers him as Edward the Confessor, and he is the still centre around which the whole storm of 1066 would turn. Edward was the son of that same Ethelred the Unready, and of Emma, the Norman noblewoman, and when the Danes had taken England in his childhood, Edward had been bundled across the Channel to safety, and had grown up in exile in Normandy, among his mother's people, speaking their French, praying in their churches, learning their ways, for something close to 30 years. He was a grown man, well into middle age, before he ever came back to rule the land of his birth, and he came back a half-stranger to it, more Norman in his manners than English, with Norman friends and Norman tastes, and a lifelong fondness for the duchy that had sheltered him. This matters more than almost anything else in the story, so let it settle gently in your mind as you rest. The King of England, in the years before the Conquest, was a man raised in Normandy, who loved Normandy, and who owed the Normans a great debt of gratitude for the long shelter of his exile. Edward was, by every account, a gentle and deeply pious man, more suited to the cloister than the throne, tall and pale with a soft voice and a fondness for prayer and for hunting, generous to the church, careful in his religion, so devout that after his death he would be made a saint, which is a rare thing for a king. But piety is not the same as strength, and Edward came to a throne already crowded with powerful men who had grown used to ruling in the absence of a strong king, and the most powerful of them all was a man named Godwin, Earl of Wessex. Godwin had risen from relatively humble beginnings to become the greatest nobleman in England, the Earl of the richest earldom, the head of a sprawling and ambitious family, and he had helped put Edward on the throne, and he expected to be repaid for it. Edward, needing Godwin's support, married Godwin's daughter, a clever and cultivated young woman named Edith, and so the old king and the great earl were bound together, uneasily, father-in-law and son-in-law, each needing the other and neither quite trusting the other. And here is the thread that will pull the whole tapestry apart. Edward and Edith had no children. Year after year the marriage remained barren, whether by misfortune or, as some later and more romantic tellers insisted, because the saintly Edward had taken a private vow to live with his wife as a brother rather than a husband. We cannot know the truth of that, and it hardly matters now. What matters is the hard political fact that hung over England for more than 20 years like the comet itself, growing brighter and more ominous as the reign wore on. The king was aging. The king had no son. The king had no obvious heir of his own blood old enough and strong enough to take the throne when he died. And a kingdom without a clear heir is a kingdom holding its breath, because every powerful man in it and every ambitious neighbour beyond its borders begins quietly to calculate. Who will it be? Who has the best claim, the strongest army, the readiest ships? Who was promised what, and by whom, and when, and can the promise be proved? For 20 years and more, beneath the calm surface of Edward's pious reign, those questions grew and hardened, and the men who would fight over the answer were, one by one, coming of age. Far across the Channel, in Normandy, a young duke was growing into a hard and formidable ruler. Up in the north in Norway, a warrior king with a legendary past was watching England the way a hawk watches a field. And close at hand, in the very household of the king, the sons of Earl Godwin were rising, and the eldest and ablest of them was a tall, capable, well-liked man named Harold, who by the last years of Edward's reign had become the most powerful subject in the kingdom. The right hand of the throne, the man who truly ran England while the old king prayed. All of them were waiting. All of them were counting the years. And the old king, gentle and remote, kept praying, and kept building his great church at Westminster, the abbey he loved above all things, and kept, whether by design or by simple weariness, giving each of these hungry men just enough hope to believe that the crown might one day be his. That was the England the comet burned over, a rich, old, well-made kingdom admired across Europe for its wealth and its coinage and its holy king, and yet balanced, without quite knowing it, on the edge of a knife, waiting for one old man to die. Let us slow down here for a little while, before the kings and the battles crowd in, and simply stand quietly in that vanished country, the England of the years before the Conquest, and feel what it was like, because it is a gentle thing to imagine, and imagining it is a good way to loosen the grip of the day. Picture the land itself, greener and wilder and far emptier than it is now, perhaps 1.5 million or 2 million souls in the whole of England, scattered thin across a country of vast forests and open heaths and wide marshes and slow winding rivers, the great woods full of deer and boar and wolves, the fenlands loud with birds, the roads few and mostly the old cracked stone highways the Romans had left, running straight across a landscape that had half forgotten them. Picture the villages, small clusters of low timber houses with steep thatched roofs, their walls of woven wattle daubed with mud and dung and straw, a single smoky room within where a family lived close about the central hearth, the fire never quite let go out, the smoke drifting up to blacken the rafters and seep out through the thatch, for there were no chimneys, only the slow blue haze and the smell of wood smoke that clung to everything and everyone. Picture the people who lived in them, most of them bound to the soil, rising with the light and lying down with the dark, their whole year shaped by the ancient unchanging round of the farm, the ploughing and the sowing in the cold months, the long anxious growing of the crops through spring and summer, the great labour of the harvest when every hand was needed and the whole village bent together over the golden fields, the slaughter of the animals in the autumn cold when there was not fodder to keep them all, through winter, the salting of the meat, the shortening days, the long, dark, hungry waiting months by the fire until the light and the ploughing came round again. It was a hard life, and a short one by our reckoning, full of toil and cold and the constant nearness of hunger and sickness, and yet it had its own deep rhythm and its own quiet beauties. The smell of turned earth in the spring, the sound of the church bell carrying across the fields, the warmth of the beasts in the byre on a winter night, the long companionable dark of the hall when the work was done. And over it all lay the church, for this was a deeply and simply Christian country, its year marked out by the feasts and the fasts, its villages gathered each week into the little stone or timber churches, its people praying to the saints and fearing hell and honouring the holy days, the great abbeys and minsters rich and learned, the monks copying their books and singing their offices through the watches of the night while the country slept around them. And above the villages stood the halls of the thegns, the local lords, longer and taller timber buildings where the lord and his household lived, and where, in the old way, men gathered to feast and drink and hear the songs, for this was still a world that loved its poetry, the old alliterating verse of heroes and battles, and the sorrow of exile, and the passing of all earthly things, chanted aloud in the firelit hall while the mead went round, the same deep elegiac note sounding through it always, that gold rusts and lords die, and halls fall empty, and the bright days do not last. A people who knew in their bones how quickly everything passes, and made a stern sad beauty out of the knowing. This was the England that the 11th century had made, a settled, ancient, deeply rooted country, not rich by our standards, but well ordered and long established, with its shires and its hundreds and its courts where free men met to settle their disputes, its silver pennies stamped with the king's head, its slow good governance reaching down from the king through the earls and the sheriffs to the humblest village. It thought itself old and safe. It had weathered the Romans' leaving and the coming of the Saxons and the long terror of the Vikings and the rule of Danish kings, and it had survived all of them, and remained, recognisably, itself English. And there was no particular reason, in the quiet years of Edward's reign, for a farmer bent over his plough on a Sussex hillside to imagine that his world stood on the edge of an ending, that within his own lifetime a new kind of lord speaking a strange new tongue would come and take his hall and his fields and remake the very order of the world he lived in. He would go on ploughing that hillside, or one very like it, and his sons after him, no matter who ruled from the hall or who sat on the distant throne, for the land does not care what language its masters speak. And someone must always feed the world. But the men who did rule, the king and the earls and the ambitious great ones, were already, in these last quiet years, beginning their long dance toward catastrophe. And it is to them, and to the tangled question of who should wear the crown when the childless old king finally died, that we must now, gently, turn. Let us cross the water now, gently, and meet the man who would win. In Normandy, a broad green duchy on the northern coast of France, there ruled a young man who had come to power in the hardest imaginable way, through a childhood so dangerous that it is a small miracle he lived to grow up at all. The Normans themselves were, if you go back far enough, Vikings, the very same restless Norse who had raided England. But these had settled a century and a half earlier along the mouth of the River Seine, where a Frankish king, unable to beat them, had given them the land in exchange for their loyalty, much as Alfred had once bought peace with a line on a map. Over the generations, these Northmen, these Normans, had become something new. They had taken the French tongue and the Christian faith and the mounted, armoured, castle-building warfare of the continent, and they had married it to the ferocious energy of their Viking blood, and the result was one of the most aggressive and successful ruling classes in all of medieval Europe. A people who in this single century would seize not only a great slice of France, but southern Italy. And Sicily as well, restless, disciplined, hungry, brilliant at war. And their duke, in the middle of the 11th century, was a man named William. William had been born the illegitimate son of the previous duke and a tanner's daughter, and when his father died on a pilgrimage, William inherited the duchy as a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, a fatherless child surrounded by powerful. treacherous kinsman who saw in his small person nothing but an obstacle to their own ambitions. His childhood was a nightmare of murder and betrayal. Guardians who protected him were killed, sometimes in the very room where he slept. His household was torn apart by feud. More than once he was smuggled away by night, hidden in the cottages of the poor, to keep him alive. A weaker soul would have been broken by it, or simply killed. William was not broken. He grew up hard, watchful, patient, and utterly without illusion. A man who trusted almost no one and forgave almost nothing, and who learned very young that power is held only by those willing to be more relentless than their enemies. By the time he reached manhood, he had fought and crushed the rebellious lords of his own duchy, he had faced down invasions by the King of France himself, and he had welded fractious Normandy into a formidable, unified fighting machine entirely loyal, or at least entirely obedient to his will. He was tall and powerfully built, with a harsh voice and a fearsome temper and an iron, tireless energy, and he was, by the standards of his brutal age, unusually pious and unusually faithful to his wife, a small, clever noblewoman named Matilda, to whom he was devoted all his life. This was the man who, across the narrow sea, began to hear that the throne of England might, one day, be within his reach. And why should he think such a thing? Because of that long-ago exile. Edward the Confessor, remember, had grown up in Normandy, sheltered by William's own family, and Edward was, through his mother Emma, William's cousin once removed, kin by blood. And at some point, most likely around the year 1051, when Edward had briefly quarrelled with the overmighty Godwin family and driven them into exile, the childless English king seems to have made, or at least to have hinted at, a momentous promise. He appears to have named William, his Norman kinsman, as his heir, to have sent word across the Channel that when he died, the crown of England should pass to the Duke of Normandy. Whether Edward truly meant it as a binding designation, or whether it was a passing gesture made in a moment of anger at the Godwins. A card played to frighten his English rivals, and then quietly forgotten, we will never be certain. But William never forgot it. From that day, in his own unshakable belief, England was promised to him, was his by right, and any other man who took it would be not a rival, but a thief and an oath-breaker, and William was a man who nursed a grievance the way a miser nurses gold. And then, some years later, fate handed William a second, even stronger card, and it handed it to him by way of his greatest rival. Because Harold Godwinson, the tall, capable earl who by now all but ruled England for the ageing king, came to Normandy. Exactly why he came, no one can say for certain, and the English and Norman sources tell the tale in very different colours. Perhaps he was shipwrecked on the French coast by an accident of weather and fell into the hands of a local lord who handed him over to William. Perhaps Edward had sent him on some errand. What is not seriously in doubt is that Harold spent time as William's guest, an honoured guest, and that the two men, the two future combatants, actually rode and fought and feasted together for a season. William even taking Harold along on a small Norman campaign, and, the Normans said, knighting him. And it is here, in Normandy, that the Norman story places the single most fateful act in the whole drama, an act that William would use, for the rest of his life, to justify everything he did. According to the Normans, Harold swore a solemn oath to William, an oath sworn on holy relics, on the bones of the saints, the most binding vow a Christian man could make, promising to support William's claim to the English throne, to be William's man in England, to help make the Duke king when Edward died. The Norman tellers would later insist that the relics had been hidden beneath a cloth so that Harold did not even know, until the oath was already spoken, how sacred were the objects his hand had rested upon, and that when the cloth was drawn back and he saw the holy bones he had sworn upon, he went pale, understanding that he had bound his very soul. Whether it happened quite like that, whether Harold swore freely or under a subtle sort of duress, a guest who could not easily refuse his powerful host, we cannot know, and the English sources are notably tellingly quiet about the whole affair. But true or exaggerated, the oath became the moral foundation stone of the entire Norman cause, In William's telling, and soon in the telling of the church, Harold Godwinson was a man who had sworn a sacred oath upon the relics of the saints and then broken it. A perjurer, an oath-breaker, a man who had damned himself, and against such a man any war was a just war, blessed by heaven. Harold went home to England. The old king prayed on in his palace at Westminster, watching his great abbey rise stone by stone. And the years ran out, quietly the way years do, until the last of them arrived. The end came in the deep cold of winter, in the first days of the year 1066, a few months before the comet would burn. Edward the Confessor, old now and failing, had at last seen his beloved abbey at Westminster finished and consecrated, dedicated at Christmas, though he was too ill by then to attend the ceremony he had waited his whole life for, and lay instead in his chamber close by, slipping in and out of consciousness while the bells rang for the church he would never see again. He lingered a few days into January, and around him gathered the great figures of the kingdom, his wife Edith warming his feet, the churchmen praying, and, close at hand, watchful, the tall figure of Harold Godwinson. And on his deathbed in his last hours, the old king is said to have spoken, and to have commended the kingdom and his widow to Harold's protection, reaching out his hand to the earl. Now what exactly that gesture meant would be argued over swords and shields within the year. To the English, it was plain enough. The dying king, in the presence of the leading men of the realm, had named Harold his successor, had entrusted England to the one man strong enough and English enough to hold it, and by the ancient custom of the land. The choice of a king belonged not to any foreign promise, but to the great council of the English, the Witan, the assembly of nobles and bishops, who had the right to choose and to crown. And the Witan, gathered in London for the Christmas court and the abbey's consecration, with the old king barely cold, chose Harold. To the Normans, of course, that same deathbed gesture was worthless, the desperate improvisation of a dying man with no right to give away what he had already, years before, solemnly promised to William, and Harold's acceptance of the crown was nothing but the final, damning proof of his treachery. The oathbreaker seizing the throne he had sworn to help another man hold. Both sides believed themselves entirely in the right, which is the way of most wars, and it is worth remembering, as you lie there in the dark, that the men who tore this kingdom apart were not villains in their own eyes, but each, in his own mind, the wronged and righteous party. Edward died on the 5th of January. He was buried the next day in the new abbey, the first king to be laid to rest in the church he had built, where his shrine still stands. And on that very same day, the 6th of January, with almost unseemly haste, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England in that same abbey, the holy oil poured on his head, the crown set upon his brow, the first King of England not born of the old royal blood, a man who had risen to the throne on ability and ambition and the choice of his fellow Englishmen. He was, by all accounts, a good and capable man, brave and generous and experienced, a proven soldier and a shrewd governor, exactly the sort of man a kingdom in danger would want at its head. But he had come to the throne with two enemies already sharpening their weapons across two different seas, and a third, more bitter still, much closer to home. Because Harold had a brother, and the brother's name was Tostig, and the quarrel between them would help bring the whole house down. Tostig Godwinson had been Earl of Northumbria, the great northern earldom, but he had ruled it so harshly, with such heavy taxes and such high-handed violence, that the northern English had risen against him in revolt, thrown him out, and demanded another lord. And Harold, forced to choose between backing his own brother and keeping the peace of the kingdom, had chosen the kingdom. He had accepted the rebels' demands, let Tostig fall, and Tostig had gone into exile across the sea, burning with a hatred for his brother so fierce that he would spend the last year of his life doing everything in his considerable power to destroy him, even at the cost of destroying England itself. And so we come to the third of our claimants, the one from the north, and he is perhaps the most extraordinary figure in the whole tale, a man whose life reads like a saga, because a saga is very nearly what it was. His name was Harold Sigurdsson, and he was King of Norway, and men called him Hardrada, the hard ruler, the stern counsel, and he was, by the year 1066, the most famous and feared warrior in the whole of the northern world. As a boy of 15 he had fought in a great battle in Norway and been left for dead on the field. He had crawled away, wounded, and fled east into the wilds of Russia, and from there he had journeyed all the way south to the golden city of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the richest city in the Christian world, and there he had joined the Varangian Guard, the elite corps of Norse warriors who served the emperor himself. For years Harold had fought across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, in Sicily and North Africa and the Holy Land, storming cities, amassing a legendary fortune in gold, becoming a warrior of almost mythical renown, before at last returning north, buying and fighting his way to the throne of Norway, and ruling it for 20 hard years. Now he was past 50, an aging giant of a man, said to stand nearly 7 feet tall, a lifetime of war behind him, and, one might think, little left to prove. But Harold Hardrada had one last ambition, and it was England. He too had a claim, of a sort, a thin and tangled one reaching back to a treaty between Knut's son and an earlier king of Norway. An agreement, so the story went, that if either died without an heir, the other should inherit his kingdom. It was a threadbare thread of a claim, but for a man like Harold it was excuse enough, and into his court came the exiled Tostig, Harold's embittered brother, urging him on, promising him English support, painting England as a rich and ill-defended prize ripe for the taking by a real warrior. And Harold Hardrada listened, and began, in the harbours of Norway, to gather the largest Viking fleet seen in a lifetime. So consider now, as the year 1066 turned towards spring, and the comet blazed and faded in the western sky, the impossible position of the newly crowned Harold of England. He was a good king with a strong claim and the love of his people, and he was surrounded. To the south, across the narrow channel, Duke William of Normandy was mustering ships and knights and calling on the Pope himself to bless a holy war against the Oathbreaker. To the north, across the wider sea, Harold Hardrada of Norway, the greatest warrior of the age, was gathering a fleet to seize England by the sword, and whispering in the Norwegian's ear, guiding him, sharpening the blade, was Harold's own brother. 2 invasions were coming, from 2 directions, led by 2 of the most dangerous men alive, and Harold could not know which would come first, or when, or where it would fall. All he could do was wait, and watch the sea, and hold his kingdom ready through the long anxious summer, and hope that when the blow came, he would be strong enough and quick enough to meet it. That summer, as it happened, would be one of the strangest and most decisive in all of English history, and it would turn in the end on nothing grander than the direction of the wind. Let us watch that summer unfold slowly, because the waiting is a story in itself. In Normandy, William set about the most ambitious undertaking of his life, and he did it with the cold thoroughness that marked everything he touched. To carry an army across the sea and conquer a kingdom, he needed ships, hundreds of them, and Normandy did not have hundreds of ships. So he had them built, all through the spring and summer, in the little harbours along the Norman coast, the sound of axes and adzes ringing out day after day as the shipwrights laid keels and bent planks and raised masts. He needed men, and he could not simply command enough of them, so he called upon his barons and promised them land and plunder in England, and word went out across northern France and beyond, into Brittany and Flanders, and as far as southern Italy, that Duke William was gathering an army for the greatest gamble of the age, and adventurers and younger sons and landless knights came flocking to his banner, drawn by the promise of English acres, until he had assembled a force of many thousands, foot soldiers and archers, and, above all, the armoured mounted knights, who were the terror of the continental battlefield. He needed horses, and the ships had to be specially built or fitted to carry them across open water, a rare and difficult thing. He needed food, and mountains of it, gathered and stored. And, cleverest of all, he needed the war to be seen not as a naked act of conquest, but as a righteous cause, and so he sent envoys to Rome, to the Pope, laying out the case against Harold. The broken oath sworn on holy relics, the perjury, the usurpation, and the Pope, persuaded, or at least willing, sent back his blessing and, it was said, a consecrated banner and a holy relic to carry into battle. So that William's invasion became, in the eyes of the Church, almost a crusade, an army marching under the banner of St. Peter to punish an oathbreaker and reform a wayward island. It was a masterpiece of preparation, patient and total, and by the height of summer it was ready, the great fleet drawn up in the estuary of the River Dives, and later at the mouth of the Somme, thousands of men and horses waiting on the sand. And then it could not move, because the wind was wrong. For week after week that summer, the wind blew steadily from the north, straight down the channel into the faces of the Norman ships, and a fleet of that size, in that age, could not row against it, and dared not sail across it. So William waited, holding his restless, hungry army together by sheer force of will and discipline, feeding them, keeping them from plundering the countryside, keeping them from drifting away, watching the sky day after day for the wind to shift. And it would not shift, and the summer burned on. On the other side of the water, Harold of England was doing his own waiting, and his was harder still. All through the summer he kept the largest army and fleet England could muster stationed along the south coast, watching for the Norman sails, the men of the Fyrd. The general levy of free Englishmen called from their farms and villages to defend the realm. But an army of farmers cannot stay in the field forever. They had crops to bring in, the whole life of the kingdom depended on the harvest, and their term of service by ancient custom ran only so long, and their supplies had limits. Harold held them as long as he possibly could, week after week into September, staring across the water at an enemy that would not come, because the enemy could not come, until at last, in the second week of September, with the harvest desperate and the food gone, and the season for invasion seeming surely to be past, he had no choice but to let them go. The Fyrd was disbanded. The men went home to their fields. The fleet sailed back around to London to refit, losing some ships in a storm on the way. The south coast of England, watched so long and so anxiously, lay open. It was one of those moments that decide the fate of nations and turn on nothing more than exhaustion and the calendar, a good king making the only sensible choice available to him and being ruined by it. Because within days of Harold standing his weary army down, the wind that had pinned William to the French coast finally began to change. And at almost the same moment, from the entirely opposite direction, from the north, the first of the two invasions fell upon England, and it was not William's, it was the Norwegian. Harald Hardrada's great fleet, 300 ships and more, had sailed at last, gathering up the exiled Tostig and his followers along the way, sweeping down the eastern coast of England, raiding as it came, and in the third week of September it entered the broad estuary of the River Humber and pushed up the river toward the great northern city of York, the ancient capital of the north, the richest and most important city in England after London. Here was the blow Harold had feared, and it had come at the worst possible moment, hundreds of miles from where his army had stood all summer, at the very instant his forces were scattered to their farms. The north of England was defended by two young earls, brothers Edwin and Morcar, powerful men in their own right, and they gathered what forces they could and marched out to meet the Norwegian giant before he could take York. They met him on the 20th of September at a place called Fulford, just south of the city, on marshy ground between the river and a dike, and there the northern English fought the Norse invaders in a hard and bloody battle. For a time the English pressed the Norwegians back, but Hardrada was a veteran of 100 fights, and he judged the moment perfectly, throwing the weight of his host against the weaker part of the English line, breaking it, driving the young earl's men back into the marsh and the river, where many of them drowned in their armour or were cut down in the mud. It was a crushing Norwegian victory. The two earls survived, but their army was shattered, and York, undefended now, opened its gates and submitted, agreeing to give hostages and supplies, and to accept Harald Hardrada as its overlord. In the space of a single afternoon, the north of England had fallen to the Norwegian, and the great warrior king, past 50 and triumphant, must have felt that his long-last gamble was won, that the richest island in the north was falling into his hands just as it had fallen to Knut 2 generations before. He and Tostig drew their army back a little way from York, to a river crossing where they would wait to receive the hostages and the submission of the surrounding country, a pleasant spot in the late summer sun, a place whose name would soon be written in blood across every chronicle in Europe. It was called Stamford Bridge, and they waited there, at their ease, many of them having left their heavy mail behind in the ships on that warm September day, expecting nothing but the quiet business of a conquest already won. They did not know that far to the south, the King of England had heard the news of Fulford, and that Harold Godwinson was already moving. Spare a thought, as the 2 great invasions gathered beyond the horizon, for the ordinary people of England through that long strange summer. The farmers and the fishermen and the village folk who knew, in the vague and frightening way that ordinary people always know such things, that something enormous was coming, and could do nothing but wait and work and pray. All along the southern coast the fyrd had been called out, and that meant that in 1,000 villages the men were gone, standing watch on the shore instead of tending the fields, and the women and the old men and the children were left to keep the farms going through the most important season of the year, watching the crops ripen, and worrying whether there would be hands enough to bring the harvest in, and worrying too about the men down on the coast, and about the sails that everyone said would come. Word travelled slowly and thickened into rumour as it went, and in the inland villages people would have heard only that the king was watching the sea, that a great Norman host was waiting across the water, that a Norwegian fleet was feared in the north, and they would have crossed themselves and gone on with the endless work of the summer, the haymaking and the weeding and the tending of the beasts. Because whatever kings and dukes might do, the cows still had to be milked, and the hay still had to be got in before the weather turned. There is something quietly moving in that, in the thought of a whole country going about its patient ordinary business right up to the very edge of catastrophe, the smoke rising from the cottage roofs, the bells ringing for mass, the slow oxen dragging the carts along the dusty lanes, all of it about to be swept into a change so total that the language itself would be remade, and none of them able to see it coming or do the least thing to turn it aside. And when at last, in September, the king was forced to send the fyrd home because the food was gone and the harvest could wait no longer, those men would have walked back to their villages along the summer roads, tired and relieved, thinking perhaps that the danger had passed for another year, that the Normans had missed their season, that they could get the harvest in after all and settle toward autumn in peace, not knowing that they had been stood down at the worst possible hour, that the sails they had watched for all summer were about to come at last onto an undefended shore, and that many of them would very shortly be called out again to march to a ridge in Sussex from which they would not return. It is one of the quiet cruelties of that year, the way the ordinary rhythm of the land, the harvest that could not be delayed, the men who had to go home and reap, worked hand in hand with the wind and the weather to undo the English king, so that in a sense it was the simple unbending needs of the farming year, the same needs that had shaped English life for 1,000 years, that helped open the door to the men who would change that life forever. The land had to be fed. The harvest had to come in. And so the watch was lowered, and the door swung open, and history walked through it. What Harold did next is one of the great feats of the age, and it deserves to be remembered whenever people imagine that the men of 1,000 years ago were somehow slower or softer than ourselves. Word of the Norwegian landing and the disaster at Fulford reached the king in the south, and Harold did not hesitate, and he did not wait to gather a perfect army. He took the household troops he had, the professional warriors called the housecarls, the finest heavy infantry in Europe, axemen sworn to the king, and he called up the fyrd of the shires along the way, and he marched north, and he marched at a speed that seems scarcely believable. From London to York is close to 200 miles, and Harold and his army covered that distance in something like 4 or 5 days, marching hard from dawn to dark day after day along the old Roman road that still ran straight and firm through the heart of England, gathering men as they went, pushing themselves to the very edge of endurance, moving so fast that the news of their coming did not outrun them. And this is the thing that decided it. Harold Hardrada and Tostig, waiting at Stamford Bridge for the hostages of a beaten country, had no idea that the King of England was anywhere near. They thought Harold was hundreds of miles away in the south, watching for the Normans. They had beaten the North's defenders. In their minds, the campaign in the north was over and won. And so on the morning of the 25th of September, a warm bright day, they lounged by the river crossing with much of the army spread out on both banks. Many without their armour, weapons stacked, when someone looked to the south and saw in the distance a great cloud of dust rising into the clear sky, and beneath it the glitter of 10,000 points of light. Sun on spearheads and mail, an army, a huge army, appearing where no army could possibly be. It was Harold and the whole English host come out of nowhere. The shock must have been total. There was no time to send back to the ships for the missing armour, no time to do anything but form up as best they could and fight. There is a famous story told in the northern sagas of how the battle began, and whether it is literally true or a saga maker's flourish, it captures something real about the desperation of that day. As the English swept forward to the bridge, a single gigantic Norse warrior is said to have planted himself in the middle of the narrow span, alone, and held the whole English army at bay, cutting down man after man who tried to cross, holding the bridge by himself for a long and terrible time, while behind him his comrades scrambled to form their battle line, until at last one clever Englishman floated underneath the bridge in a small boat or a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planks into the giant from below. Only then could the English pour across, and then the battle proper began, and it was long and savage and fought without mercy under the hot September sun. The Norwegians, caught by surprise, without their armour, outnumbered, fought with the desperate courage of doomed men, forming their shield wall, holding, breaking, reforming. Somewhere in the thick of it Harold Hardrada, the giant, the last great Viking, the man who had fought in Constantinople and Sicily and Africa and the Holy Land, was struck in the throat by an arrow and fell, and with him fell the old northern world, for there would never be another like him. Tostig, Harold's brother, took up the fallen banner and fought on, and Harold is said to have offered his brother peace even then, even at that last hour, offered him his earldom back if he would lay down his arms, and Tostig, whether from pride or hatred or the knowledge that it was already too late, refused and fought, and died there too, so that the day ended with both the brothers' quarrel and the Norwegian dream drowned together in the same red field. The Norse army was annihilated. Of the 300 and more ships that had brought the great host to England, so few men survived to sail home that, it was said, only 24 ships were needed to carry them, and Harold, in a gesture that mixed mercy and contempt, let the remnant go, allowing the young Norwegian prince and the survivors to depart in peace on the promise never to return, which they never did. It was one of the most complete victories in English history. The last great Viking invasion of England had been met and utterly destroyed, and the threat that had hung over the island for close to 300 years, since the monks of Lindisfarne first saw the dragon ships, was ended forever on that September afternoon. Harold Godwinson had, in a matter of weeks, marched the length of his kingdom, surprised and crushed the most feared warrior in the world, and saved England from the north. Had the story ended there, he would be remembered today as one of the great kings of the English, the man who broke the Vikings at last, a hero out of the old songs. He must have felt, standing on that field among the dead, an enormous, exhausted triumph, the sense of a mortal danger faced and beaten, of a kingdom saved. And it was in that very moment of triumph, with his army bloodied and weary and far, far from home in the north of England, that the wind in the south changed. for all through those same days. While Harold was marching north and fighting his great battle, Duke William of Normandy had been waiting on the French coast, watching the sky, and the same shift of weather that had finally freed the north wind to bring Hardrada south now swung the wind at last into the south, filling the Norman sails, and William did not waste an hour of it. On the 27th of September, just 2 days after Stamford Bridge, the great Norman fleet put to sea at last under cover of night, hundreds of ships crowded with knights and horses and men, and William's own ship, the fastest, running ahead in the dark so far that at dawn it found itself alone on the empty sea, the rest of the fleet nowhere in sight, and the story goes that the Duke, untroubled, sat down and calmly ate a good breakfast, while lookouts climbed the mast, until at last the forest of masts appeared on the horizon behind him. On the morning of the 28th of September, the Norman fleet came ashore on the south coast of England, at Pevensey, on the flat marshy ground of the Sussex shore, and the army disembarked unopposed onto an undefended beach, because the King of England and all his host were 250 miles away in Yorkshire, standing among the corpses of the men they had just beaten. William, it is said, stumbled and fell as he stepped onto English soil, an omen his men took for disaster, until the quick-witted Duke rose with his fists full of English sand and cried out that he had taken England into his 2 hands, turning the stumble into a sign of triumph, for he was a man who let nothing, not even his own clumsiness, be read as a defeat. The Normans had landed, and in the north a tired king turned his exhausted army around and began, once again, to march. The news reached Harold in the north, most likely at York, only a few days after his great victory, while his men were still resting and tending their wounds and burying their dead. The Normans had landed in Sussex, and so the king, who had just performed one astonishing forced march, was called upon immediately to perform another, this time in the opposite direction, back down the whole length of England, from Yorkshire to the south coast, with an army that had already marched 200 miles and fought one of the hardest battles of the century. It is worth pausing here, as you lie in the quiet, to feel the sheer human weight of that moment, because it is easy, reading history, to move armies across a map like counters and forget that every counter is thousands of tired men. These were men who had walked for days, fought for their lives, lost friends and brothers, and were only just beginning to believe they had survived, and now they were told to turn around and walk the same brutal distance again to face a second, fresh, and even more dangerous enemy. Some of them, the northern levies especially, could not or would not do it, and drifted away home. But the king went, and his household warriors went with him, and Harold drove south with the same furious speed that had served him so well, reaching London in a matter of days and pausing there only briefly to gather what new forces he could from the south and east, the men of the home counties, the third of London and the surrounding shires. And here we come to one of the great and unanswerable questions of the whole story, the decision that historians have argued over for 900 years. Harold did not wait. He could have waited. He could have stayed in London, or even further back, and let his weary army rest and swell, drawing in the full strength of the kingdom over the following weeks, forcing William to come to him, stretching the Norman supply lines, letting the autumn turn to winter around the invaders far from home. Many of his advisers, it is said, urged exactly this caution. His own brother Gurth is supposed to have offered to lead the army himself, so that if it were beaten the king at least would survive to fight again, and to have begged Harold not to risk his own person and his crown on a single throw of the dice. But Harold would not wait, and we can only guess at his reasons, and probably they were many and human and tangled. William, down in Sussex, was deliberately and systematically laying waste to the countryside around his landing place, burning the villages, driving off the livestock, killing and plundering across the very lands that were, as it happened, Harold's own family estates, the ancestral heartland of the House of Godwin. It was a calculated provocation, a way of shaming and goading the English king into coming quickly, of saying to him, in the language of fire, that a true king does not leave his own people to burn. And it worked, because Harold was a proud man and a Godwin, and these were his people. And perhaps too because he had just seen, at Stamford Bridge, exactly what a sudden, fast, unexpected march could achieve, how a surprise stroke could shatter a confident enemy. And he may have hoped to catch William off guard as he had caught the Norwegians, to fall upon the Norman camp before the Duke was ready. So Harold gathered his strength as quickly as he could and marched out of London toward the coast, toward Sussex, toward William, and on the night of the 13th of October, his army arrived at a place a few miles inland from the Norman landing ground, at a point where the old road from London to the coast crossed a long low ridge, with the Andredsweald, the great forest, at his back, and open ground falling away in front. It was a good defensive position, a ridge that would force any attacker to fight uphill, and Harold denied his hoped for surprise because William's scouts had warned the Duke of his coming, chose to stand there and let the Normans break themselves against him. He drew up his army along the top of the ridge that night, and the two hosts camped within a few miles of one another in the darkness. Close enough, the chroniclers say, that the sounds of each carried faintly to the other, and the character of the two camps that night, in the telling, could not have been more different. Though we should take the moralizing of the monks with a pinch of salt. The Normans, they said, spent the night in prayer and confession, making their souls ready before battle, while the English, exhausted and perhaps overconfident after their northern triumph, spent it feasting and singing and drinking, which may be true or may be a Norman flourish designed to make heaven's favour seem well earned. What is certainly true is that Harold's army was tired, that many of its best men had fallen in the north or been left behind, that the levies were thinner than they should have been, and that the king was gambling everything, his crown, his life and the independence of England, on a single day's fighting against the most carefully prepared army the age could produce. Dawn came on the morning of the 14th of October, a Saturday, cool and clear. The English stood in their long shield wall along the crest of the ridge, thousands of men packed shoulder to shoulder, the housecarls with their great two-handed axes in the centre around the king and his banners, the golden dragon of Wessex, and Harold's own standard of the fighting man, worked in gold thread. The third filling out the line on either side, a solid wall of shields and spears, perhaps 600 or 700 yards long, anchored on the high ground, hard to outflank, terrible to charge. It was the classic formation of the northern peoples, the wall of shields, and behind it the men could hold and hold and hold, and if it did not break, it could not be beaten. Below them, on the lower ground, William marshalled his army into three great lines, the archers and crossbowmen in front, the armoured foot soldiers behind them, and behind those the flower of his host, the mounted knights, the heavy cavalry that had never yet failed him. The two ways of war faced each other across that Sussex slope, the old and the new, the shield wall of the north against the combined arms of the continent, the axe against the horse, and everything that England had been, and everything it was about to become hung, suspended, in the cool October air, waiting for the horns to sound. The battle began, as far as we can tell, in the middle of the morning, and it would last almost the whole of the day. An extraordinary length for a medieval battle, most of which were decided in an hour or two. That alone tells us how evenly matched these two armies were, and how desperately hard the fighting must have been. There is a tale, and it is a good one, that the Norman advance was opened by a single warrior minstrel named Taillefer, who rode out ahead of the whole army juggling his sword and singing an old song of Roland and the heroes of Charlemagne, and who charged alone into the English line and was killed there, the first man to fall, a small strange flourish of doomed bravado at the opening of a long day of death. Then William sent his archers forward. They came up the slope and loosed their arrows at the English wall, but the ground was against them, for they were shooting uphill, and many of their arrows either fell short or flew harmlessly over the heads of the crouching English, or stuck fast in the wall of shields, and because the English had few archers of their own to shoot back. The Norman bowmen could not even gather up spent arrows from the ground to reuse them, and their opening barrage did little. Then came the infantry, the armoured foot soldiers, climbing the slope into a storm of everything the English could throw, spears and javelins and stones, and the terrible sweep of the housecarls' long axes. weapons that could cleave a man from crown to breastbone or take the head from a horse in a single blow, and the Norman foot recoiled, unable to break the wall. And so at last William committed his knights, the mounted heart of his army, and they thundered up the slope in their mail with their long lances and their kite-shaped shields, and they crashed against the shield wall, and the shield wall held. This was the crux of the whole battle, and it went on for hours. The Norman cavalry, the most feared force on any continental field, charged again and again into the English line, and again the English absorbed the shock and threw them back down the hill. A horse will not willingly gallop into a solid hedge of spear points and shields, and a rider cannot break a wall of disciplined men who do not run, and so long as the English held their formation and kept their nerve and stayed on the high ground, they could not be broken, and the Normans died in front of them, and the slope grew slippery and crowded with the fallen. For a while it seemed the English might actually win, might hold out until the Normans, unable to break through and far from home, simply lost heart and broke off. And then came the moment that turned the day, and it turned on a rumour and a panic. On the Norman left, the Breton troops, hard pressed and taking heavy losses against the English right, gave way and began to flee back down the hill, and as they fled a terrible cry ran through the whole Norman army. The cry that the Duke was dead, that William had fallen, and for an instant the entire invasion trembled on the edge of collapse, because an army that believes its leader dead is already half beaten. And here William did the thing that saved him, the thing that only the coolest and hardest of men could do in the middle of a rout. He pushed back his helmet so that his face was bare, and he rode along his wavering line where every man could see him, and he shouted that he was alive, that he lived, that they should look at him and fight on, and the sight of his living face steadied them, and the panic passed. But something else had happened in that moment, something that would prove fatal to the English. When the Bretons fled, a part of the English line, the less disciplined men of the third on the right, seeing their enemies running, could not resist the ancient temptation, and they broke ranks and charged down the hill after them, chasing the fleeing Bretons, hungry for the kill. And the instant they left the ridge, the instant they came down off the high ground and lost the protection of the wall and the slope, they were finished, because William, quick as ever to seize a chance, wheeled his mounted knights around and fell upon the scattered pursuers in the open, where cavalry is master, and cut them to pieces, ringing them round and killing them almost to a man. It was a small disaster for the English, a piece of the line gone, but far more important was the lesson William drew from it, the deadly idea that would win him the battle. He had seen that the English, so unbreakable while they stood still, could be lured off their ridge by the sight of a fleeing enemy, and that once off it, they could be destroyed. And so, through the long afternoon, the Normans are said to have done it again, this time on purpose, twice more turning and feigning flight, pretending to break and run, drawing knots of Englishmen off the hill in eager pursuit, and then turning on them in the open and slaughtering them. Whether these feigned flights were as neat and deliberate as the Norman chroniclers claimed, or whether they were partly real routes that William managed to turn to advantage after the fact, we cannot be certain, for it is a very hard thing to make trained men pretend to flee and then rally on command in the chaos of a battle. But by whatever mixture of trick and accident, the result was the same. Piece by piece, hour by hour, the English line was thinned, its numbers worn away, the impetuous and the brave lured out and killed, the wall growing shorter and thinner and more desperate as the light began, at last, to fade. And still at the centre, around the king and his banners, the housecarls held, the professional corps of the English army, the finest infantry in the world, standing over their fallen comrades, hewing with their axes, refusing to break though they must have known by now, as the afternoon wore toward evening and their numbers dwindled and no help came, that the day was slipping away from them. The battle had already lasted longer than almost any in memory. Both armies were beyond exhaustion, the slope carpeted with the dead and dying of both sides. Men and horses tangled together, the English wall pulled back now into a smaller and smaller ring on the very crest of the hill. William had thrown everything at them and they had not broken. and there could not be much daylight left, and if the English could only hold until dark, the Normans would have to draw off, and Harold would have survived, and a survived king is a victorious king. It came down, in the end, to a race between the failing English line and the failing October light. And it was then, in the last hour, that William changed his tactics one final time and sent his archers forward again, but now with a new order. This time, the tradition tells us, William ordered his archers to shoot not straight at the shield wall, where their arrows were wasted, but high into the air, so that the shafts would arc up over the English shields and fall down out of the darkening sky onto the heads and faces of the men crowded behind the wall, who had to choose, with each falling volley, between raising their shields against the arrows overhead and lowering them against the swords and lances in front. It was a cruel and clever stroke, and it filled the last of the English light with a slow steady rain of falling iron, and men in the packed ranks began to fall with arrows in their necks and shoulders and eyes. And it is here, in this last grim phase of the battle, that the most famous single image in all of English history is supposed to have happened. The image woven into the great embroidered chronicle of the whole campaign, the Bayeux Tapestry, made only a few years afterward. For somewhere in that falling rain of arrows, King Harold of England, standing among his housecarls beneath his banner of the fighting man, was struck, and the oldest tradition, the one shown in the tapestry and repeated down the centuries, says that he was hit in the eye by an arrow falling from the sky, and clutched at the shaft and reeled, blinded and in agony, and that in the same terrible confusion a group of Norman knights broke through at last to the very foot of the banners, and cut the wounded king down where he stood, hacking him to death so savagely that his body was afterward hard to identify. Whether the arrow in the eye is literally true, or a later reading of a worn and ambiguous image, or a symbolic detail, a fitting doom, so the medieval mind thought. For a man believed to have perjured himself, we cannot now be sure, and honest historians admit the doubt. But the essential fact is not in doubt at all. King Harold died on that ridge, in the last hour of that long day, with the crown he had worn for barely 9 months, and with him died his 2 brothers, Gyrth and Leofwine, who had stood and fought beside him to the end, so that the whole leadership of England, the whole house of Godwin, was wiped out in a single evening on a single hill. And when the word spread down the thinning line that the king was dead, that the banners were down, the thing that Harold had feared and staved off all day finally happened. The heart went out of the English army. The Fyrd, the levies of the shires, seeing the king fallen and the cause lost and the dark coming on, at last broke and fled, streaming back off the ridge into the great forest behind them, scattering into the falling night, and only the housecarls, the sworn men of the king's own household, kept their oath to the bitter end. Gathering in a last shrinking ring around the fallen bodies of their lord and his banners, and there they died, all of them, refusing to run, cut down one by one in the dusk over the corpse of the king they had failed to save, keeping faith when faith could no longer change anything, which is perhaps the purest and most useless and most human kind of courage there is. There was one last flurry of blood in the darkness. Some of the fleeing English, or perhaps a band of fresh men come too late to the field, rallied in the twilight at a steep ditch or ravine behind the ridge, a place the Normans afterward called the Malfoss, the evil ditch, and there in the confusion and the dark, a body of pursuing Norman knights galloped headlong into the hidden drop and fell, horses and riders together, and were killed by the rallying English in a brief savage skirmish, a final small English victory in the wreck of the greater defeat, a last handful of the old order taking a last handful of the new down with them into the dark. And then it was over. Night fell on the ridge in Sussex, and the battle that would be remembered as the Battle of Hastings, though it was fought some miles from the town of that name, was ended, and Duke William of Normandy stood victorious on a hill, heaped with the dead, master of the field, though not yet, not by a long way, master of England. The cost had been staggering for both sides. Thousands lay dead on that single slope, the flower of the English fighting men, the housecarls who could never be replaced, and a terrible number of Norman knights and horses as well, for the English had sold themselves dearly and very nearly won. William, the chroniclers say, had 3 horses killed under him in the course of the day, and fought on foot in the thick of it more than once, and came through it all untouched, which he and his army took, naturally. As the clearest possible sign that God had been on their side, he ordered his own dead gathered and buried, and left the English dead where they lay on the field, or gave them up in the end to such of their kin as came to search for them. And there is a small, sad, human code of the battle that is worth carrying with you into sleep, because it says something about what was lost. When the fighting was over and the victors came to find the body of King Harold among the mounded dead, they could not at first identify him, so terribly had he been cut about, and the tradition says that it was a woman who was sent for to find him. A woman named Edith, called Edith Swan Neck, who had been Harold's companion and the mother of his children for 20 years in the old English way, more wife than not, and that she walked among the corpses in the aftermath of the slaughter and knew her man, in the end not by his face, which was gone, but by certain private marks on his body known only to her, and so gave a name back to the King of England, lying nameless among his housecarls. It is one of the oldest and most human moments in our whole history, a woman searching a battlefield for the body of the man she loved, and it belongs to Harold as much as any crown or banner, and it is where, for me, the story of Anglo-Saxon England truly ends, on that darkening field, with that terrible tender searching. But winning a battle, even so great a battle, is not the same as winning a kingdom, and William knew it better than anyone. He had destroyed the English army and killed the English king, but England was a large and populous and wealthy land, full of walled towns and great men and thousands upon thousands of people who had never seen a Norman and had no intention of bowing to one, and there remained in London an alternative king around whom the whole country might yet rally, for the surviving English leaders, the churchmen and the 2 northern earls and the citizens of London, did what their law entitled them to do, and chose a new king from the old royal blood, a boy named Edgar, called the Etheling, the last male descendant of the ancient line of Alfred and Cut's English predecessors, the true throne worthy heir by blood. Edgar was young and had no army and no experience, but he was a rallying point, a legitimate English king proclaimed in London, and had the English rallied behind him with real resolve, the Norman conquest might yet have foundered. William's task now was to make sure they never did, and he went about it with the same patient, methodical ruthlessness he had shown in everything else. He did not rush foolishly on London, where the citizens might have held the walls against him and bled his weakened army in the streets. Instead, he waited on the coast for a while to rest and reinforce, and then he began a slow, deliberate, terrible march, not straight at the capital, but in a great arc around it, through Kent and along the old roads, taking the surrender of Dover and Canterbury, moving through the country and wherever he met resistance or even reluctance, burning it, harrying the land, destroying villages and crops and driving off the animals, a moving lesson written in smoke that said to every town and every lord in England that the price of defiance was ruin and the price of submission was peace. He circled west and north of London, cutting the city off, wasting the country all around it, until the men who had proclaimed young Edgar king began to understand that no help was coming, that the north would not rise in time, that the great warrior earls of Mercia and Northumbria, Edwin and Morcar, who had been beaten at Fulford before Hastings was even fought, had gone home to their own lands and would not stake everything on a boy's cause, and that behind the walls of London there was no army capable of facing the man who had beaten Harold. And so, one by one, the leaders of English resistance came out to submit. At a place called Berkhamsted, north of London, the great men of England came to William, the boy Edgar among them, and the archbishops, and the earls, and the chief citizens, and they gave themselves up, and offered him the crown, and swore to be his men, choosing, as men usually do in the end, survival and the hope of keeping their lands over a hopeless fight to the death. William accepted their submission and promised, as conquerors always promise, to be a good and gracious lord to them, to rule them justly and keep their laws. Promises he half meant and half kept, and the way to London and to the throne lay open. It had taken him only about 2 months from the landing at Pevensey to the submission of the English leaders, a remarkably short time to break the will of a kingdom, and it is a measure of how completely the catastrophe at Hastings had decapitated England. Killing in a single day the king and his brothers and the entire professional corps of the army, that there was simply no one and nothing left with the strength and the standing to organise a real resistance in that first crucial winter. The speed of it was itself a kind of trap that would take years to fully close, for a country conquered so fast has not truly been conquered in its heart, only stunned, and the stunned wake angry. But for now, in the last cold weeks of the year 1066, William had what he had crossed the sea for. He brought his army to London and prepared to be made king, not merely as a conqueror by right of the sword, though he was that, but properly, formally, in the sacred English way, crowned and anointed with holy oil in a church before God and the people, because William was always careful to wrap his conquest in the cloak of legitimacy, to be able to say that he was the lawful and rightful and God-chosen king of the English, the true heir of Edward, and not simply a foreign robber who had taken the land by force. And the church he chose for his crowning was, fittingly, the one that stood at the very heart of the whole tragedy, the great new abbey at Westminster, the church that the saintly Edward the Confessor had loved and built and been buried in not 12 months before, the church where Harold had been crowned in the January of that same year, and from which he had ridden out to his death. In that abbey, on the most symbolic day in the Christian calendar, William would take the crown that 3 men had died for, and there, amid the incense and the singing, the ceremony would go strangely, frighteningly wrong, in a way that seemed to reveal, for one sharp moment, the fear and the blood that lay beneath the whole grand pretence of a peaceful and lawful succession. It was Christmas Day, the 25th of December, in the year 1066, less than 3 months after the Norman ships had first grounded on the Sussex sand. Inside Westminster Abbey, William, Duke of Normandy, knelt before the altar to be made King of the English, surrounded by his Norman lords in their mail and by such of the English great men as had submitted. The ceremony conducted with all the ancient solemnity the English Church could muster, the questions asked in both English and French, so that both peoples gathered there could understand and give their assent, the crowd inside the church calling out their acclamation of the new king, as custom required, a great shout of acceptance rising up under the high new roof. And that shout was the problem. Outside the abbey, William had stationed a strong guard of Norman soldiers, mounted and armed, ringing the church, because he trusted nothing and no one in this conquered and sullen city, and feared an ambush even in his moment of triumph. And when the guards outside heard the sudden roar of many voices burst out from within the abbey, the great acclaiming shout of the coronation, they did not understand the English and French words. They heard only a mass of voices raised in a shout inside a building full of the enemies of their duke. And in their fear and their ignorance they leapt to the conclusion that treachery was afoot, that the English inside were rising up to murder William at the very altar. And the Norman guards did what frightened soldiers in a hostile city do, the worst possible thing. They panicked, and they began, as a diversion or in blind reprisal, to set fire to the houses around the abbey. The flames spread quickly through the wooden buildings, and the smoke and the roar of the fire reached the people inside the church. And now real panic seized the congregation, and the crowd broke and rushed for the doors, some fleeing the supposed massacre, some running to fight the fire, some, it was darkly said, taking advantage of the chaos to plunder in the confusion, so that the great sacred ceremony dissolved into terror and shouting and running feet, and the abbey emptied out into the firelit December afternoon. And in the middle of it all, at the altar, almost alone now but for the trembling clergy who dared not stop, stood William, and the chroniclers tell us, in one of the few glimpses we ever get of fear on that iron face, that the Duke himself shook, that he trembled violently as the priests hurried through the remainder of the rite, and that the anointing and the crowning were finished in haste in a nearly empty church while fires burned outside and his new subjects scattered in panic through the streets. It was, if you believe in omens, and the men of that age most certainly did, about the worst omen imaginable for the beginning of a reign, a coronation drowned in fire and blood and terror, the new king shaking at his own altar, and it seemed to say that this crown had been taken by violence and would be held by violence, and that no amount of holy oil and Latin prayer could wash the fear and the fire out of it. And in a sense the omen was true, because the reign that began in that burning December would be built, for years to come, on force, on castles, on fear, and on the slow, grinding, and often brutal subjugation of a people who had submitted with their mouths, but not with their hearts. William was crowned. He was King of England now, in law and in ritual, and in the eyes of the Church and of God, and he set about at once the enormous task of actually ruling the land he had won. And here we must be fair to him, because William was not a mere destroyer, and the first thing he tried to do was in fact to rule the English gently, to keep his coronation promises, to govern as a lawful English king rather than a foreign tyrant. In that first year he confirmed the laws and customs of Edward the Confessor. He kept many English officials in place. He tried to work through the existing machinery of the English state, which was, by the standards of the age, an astonishingly sophisticated and effective machine, with its shires and its sheriffs and its courts and its silver coinage and its written writs, far more advanced than anything in Normandy, so that in truth the conquerors had seized one of the best governed kingdoms in Europe, and were wise enough, at first, to keep the machine running rather than smash it. He even, that first year, felt secure enough to leave England altogether and return in triumph to Normandy for a long visit, parading his English hostages and his English plunder before the admiring crowds of his homeland, showing off the fabulous wealth of the island he had won, leaving England in the hands of his most trusted men. But underneath the show of a peaceful and lawful new reign, the resentment of a conquered people was already beginning to smoulder, and William's efforts at gentleness would not survive contact with English rebellion, because every time the English rose against him, and rise they did, again and again over the next several years, William answered with a harshness that grew colder and more terrible with each revolt, until at last, in the north of England, he would do a thing so cruel that the chroniclers, even the Norman ones, even the ones who loved him, would flinch from it and set it down as a stain upon his soul that no penance could ever quite wash away. The rebellions came, as rebellions do, from every quarter and one after another, so that for the first 4 or 5 years of his reign William was less a king enjoying his conquest than a man fighting a long exhausting series of fires that kept breaking out behind him the moment he turned his back. In the west the city of Exeter shut its gates and defied him, and the widow of King Harold himself, his mother Gaitha, was there within the walls, and William marched down and besieged the city, and took it and set a castle over it to keep it quiet. In the marshes and fens of the east, a local English then named Hereward, remembered ever after as Hereward the Wake, meaning the watchful, made himself the leader of a stubborn resistance, gathering the disaffected on the Isle of Ely, a place then almost surrounded by trackless marsh and water, and holding out there against the Normans for a long time, becoming over the centuries a kind of English folk hero, the last free Englishman fighting in the reeds against the foreign lord, until at last the Normans, with the help, it was said, of treacherous monks who showed them the secret paths, forced their way across the marsh and broke the resistance of the fens. But the great danger, the rebellion that shook William most, and drew out of him his most terrible response, came from the north, from Northumbria and Yorkshire, the old Danish settled lands that had never loved any southern king, and loved a Norman one least of all. Twice the north rose. The northern English hated their new Norman overlords, whose brutality and arrogance sparked fury, and they were joined by the survivors of the old order, by the young earls Edwin and Morcar, by the Etheling Edgar who had fled north, and, most dangerous of all, by a great fleet sent from Denmark, for the Danish king still remembered that England had once been ruled from Denmark, and thought that, in the chaos of the conquest, he might take it back. In the year 1069 the north exploded. The city of York, the key to the whole region, was seized by the rebels, the Norman garrison there was massacred, hundreds of Normans killed, and for a moment it seemed the whole northern half of England might tear itself free of William's grip, and that the Danish king might land and be welcomed as Knut had once been welcomed. It was the gravest crisis of the reign, and William, who had been dealing with troubles in the south and west, turned north with cold fury in his heart. And what he did then, in the winter of 1069 and into 1070, is remembered as one of the darkest deeds in the whole history of these islands, and it has a name: the harrying of the north. William resolved that the north would never rise against him again, and he chose to make that certain not by defeating its armies, which he did easily enough, but by destroying its very ability to sustain human life. He sent his men out across the shires of the north, across Yorkshire and beyond, in the depths of winter, with orders to lay the whole country waste, and they did it with a thoroughness that still chills the blood 1,000 years later. They burned the villages and the houses, they burned the crops in the barns and the seed corn that would have been next year's planting. They slaughtered the cattle and the sheep and the pigs, or drove them off, and what they could not carry they killed and left to rot. They burned the tools and the ploughs. They salted, in effect, the earth of a whole region, and then they rode away and left the people to the winter. And the people died. They died in their thousands and their tens of thousands, not so much by the sword as by the slower and crueler means of hunger, starving through that terrible winter and the famine that followed it, with no food, no seed, no animals, no shelter. The survivors reduced, the horrified chroniclers say, to eating dogs and horses and rats, and in the last extremity one another, or fleeing south as beggars and refugees, selling themselves into slavery for a mouthful of bread, dying by the roadsides, whole districts emptied of every living soul. One writer, a monk who was himself of mixed Norman and English blood, and generally admired William, wrote of the harrying with open horror, saying that he could not praise the king for this, that this was a deed of such cruelty against so many innocent people, the young and the old, the women and the children, that it could never be justified, and that William would answer for it before God. Modern historians argue about the numbers, and whether the devastation was quite as total as the chroniclers claimed, but there is no serious doubt that it was a deliberate, systematic act of mass destruction that killed a huge number of people and left much of the north a wasted, depopulated ruin for a generation, so ruined that when William's officials came 16 years later to survey the wealth of England for the great record we call Domesday, they still found, again and again, in village after northern village, only a single flat and final Latin word written beside the name: Wasta, waste, waste, waste. The ghost of the harrying still visible in the ledger of the kingdom a decade and a half after the fires went out. It worked, in the brutal sense that it was meant to work. The north never rose against William again. But it was a piece of the graveyard, bought at a price in human suffering that appalled even the hard men of that hard age. And it fixed forever, in the memory of the English, the shape of what had happened to them, that a foreign lord had come over the sea and taken their land and their king, and that when they resisted, he had answered not with justice, but with fire and famine on a scale that beggared belief. Once the rebellions were crushed and the north was silent, William set about the deeper and more lasting work of the conquest, the remaking of England itself, and it is here that 1066 truly earns its place as the great hinge of English history, because what the Normans did over the following 20 years did not merely change who sat on the throne, it changed who owned the land, who ruled the villages, what language the powerful spoke, how the church was ordered, what the buildings looked like, and, in ways still visible today, the very words in the mouths of the English. Consider first the castles, because the castle was the physical instrument of the whole conquest, and it was a thing England had scarcely known before the Normans came. The Anglo-Saxons had built fortified towns and earthen ramparts, but they had not built the private stone and timber strongpoint of a single lord, planted in the middle of a conquered population to hold it down. And the Normans built these everywhere, with astonishing speed. Wherever they took control, they threw up a castle, at first usually the quick kind called a motte and bailey, a great artificial mound of earth with a wooden tower on top and a fenced enclosure at its foot, raised in a matter of weeks by the forced labour of the very people it was meant to overawe. And later, at the most important sites, the massive stone keeps whose ruins still stand grey and square across the country to this day. The greatest of them all rose in London itself, the mighty stone tower that William began beside the river to cow his uneasy capital, the building we still call the Tower of London, its oldest heart the great pale keep the Normans raised, a permanent stone statement. Visible from all over the medieval city, that the new masters were here and were not leaving. These castles were something new and hated, the strongpoints of a foreign occupation, and the English chroniclers speak of them with loathing, of how the land was filled with castles and the poor people were ground down building them, but they were terribly effective, for a small number of armoured men in a castle could dominate a whole district, and there was no answer to them. And it was the castle, as much as the cavalry charge, that made the conquest permanent. And then there was the far greater and quieter revolution, the one that touched every acre of England, the wholesale replacement of the old English ruling class by a new Norman one. This was not written in any single dramatic decree, but it happened, steadily and almost completely, over the 20 years of William's reign, and it was the most thorough dispossession of a native aristocracy that Europe would see for centuries. Before Hastings, England had been owned and governed by thousands of English thegns and earls, families rooted in the land for generations, holding their estates by English custom. After the Conquest, and above all after each rebellion gave William the excuse to confiscate more, those English landholders were stripped of their lands, one after another, and the estates were handed instead to William's followers, to the Norman and French and Breton barons and knights who had crossed the sea with him, and to whom he owed the rewards he had promised. By the end of his reign, the transformation was all but total. Of the many thousands of substantial estates in England, almost none, a mere handful, remained in English hands. The whole top layer of English society, the earls and the great thegns, had been swept away, killed, exiled or reduced to poverty, and in their place sat a few hundred Norman families, a small, foreign, French-speaking warrior aristocracy sitting atop a vast English population that it ruled but did not mingle with and could barely speak to, and the land was held now on new terms by the system we call feudalism, brought over whole from the continent and stamped down upon England. In this system, in theory and increasingly in practice, all the land belonged ultimately to the king, and the great barons held their vast estates directly from William in return for a solemn oath of loyalty, and above all, for military service, each great lord owing the king a fixed number of mounted armoured knights whenever he called for them. And those great lords in turn parcelled out their lands to lesser knights on the same terms, service and loyalty, in exchange for an estate. And so on down, a great pyramid of obligation and dependence reaching from the king at the top, through the barons and the knights down at last, to the English peasants at the bottom, who did the actual work of feeding everyone, and who found that whatever their status had been before, they were now, more and more, bound to the land and to the lord who held it. It was a tighter, harder, more military way of holding a country than the older English way, and it welded England into a single sharp instrument of the king's power, and it was one of William's most enduring legacies, the framework of lord and vassal and service that would shape English society for 400 years and more. To make sure it all worked, to make sure that every last knight owed to the crown could be summoned, and every last acre accounted for, William would in time order the making of the most extraordinary administrative document of the entire Middle Ages, a survey of his new kingdom so complete and so searching that the English, awed and appalled, gave it a name borrowed from the end of the world, and called it the Domesday Book. It happened near the end of William's life, in the year 1086, 20 years after the landing. The king, an ageing man now, holding his Christmas court at Gloucester, had, the chronicle says, deep speech with his councillors, and out of that speech came the order to survey the whole of England. And the survey that followed was so unlike anything that had been done before that it takes an effort to grasp how strange and how ambitious it was for its time. William sent his commissioners out across the length and breadth of the kingdom, into every shire, and in each place they summoned juries of local men, the sheriff and the priest and the reeve, and a set of villagers from each village, English and Norman alike, and put them on oath, and asked them a long and searching list of questions about every single manor and estate in the land. Who held this land in the time of King Edward, before the Conquest? Who holds it now? How large is it? How many ploughs are there? How many peasants of each kind? How many slaves? How much woodland? How much meadow? How many mills and fish ponds? How many pigs the woods could feed? What was it worth then? What is it worth now? And could it be made to yield more? And all of this, for tens of thousands of places, from the greatest baronial estate down to the smallest hamlet, was gathered and checked and written down and boiled together by the royal clerks into a single vast record, county by county, manor by manor, an almost unbelievable feat of organisation for the 11th century, carried out with a speed and a completeness that no other kingdom in Europe could have matched, and that England itself would not match again for many centuries. The result was 2 great volumes of tightly written Latin, the survey of a whole kingdom captured on parchment, and it survives to this day, 900 years old, still legible, one of the most remarkable documents ever produced by any government anywhere. And the English, when the commissioners came round with their questions, hated and feared it, because they saw exactly what it was for. It was for taxation, and for control, a tool to let the king know precisely what every man held, and what every man owed, and what every acre could be squeezed to yield, so that nothing could be hidden from the crown, and no wealth could escape the king's reckoning. There is a bitter and famous passage in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by an Englishman living through it, complaining that the king had the survey made so thoroughly, so shamefully thoroughly, that not one hide of land, not one yard, not, the writer says with wounded exaggeration, one ox nor one cow nor one pig was left out that was not set down in his record. It was this quality, the sense that nothing could escape it, that gave the survey its enduring name. The people did not call it a survey or a description, they called it the Domesday Book. After the day of doom, the last judgment at the end of the world when in Christian belief, every soul would be summoned before God, and every deed would be laid bare, and there could be no appeal, and no concealment, and no escape from the final reckoning. That, they felt, was what this book was. A Domesday, a day of judgment, from whose verdict on who held what there was no arguing, and the grim, half-admiring nickname stuck, and it is the name we use still. And when it was done, William summoned the landholders of England to him, at Salisbury, at a great gathering, and there, in what is remembered as the Oath of Salisbury, he made not only his own barons, but the important men who held land under them, the under-tenants, come and swear loyalty directly to him, the king, above and before their loyalty to any other lord. A clever and characteristic stroke that bound the whole landowning class of England to the crown by a personal oath, and made sure that in England, unlike in much of the fractured continent, the king would always stand above even the greatest of his barons. It was the capstone of the whole structure William had built, the survey and the oath together, knowledge and loyalty. The king who knew everything his kingdom held, and to whom every man who held it had personally sworn. In 20 years the fatherless boy who had hidden in peasant cottages to stay alive had made himself the master of one of the best governed and most tightly held kingdoms in all of Christendom. But the man himself was old now, and heavy, and worn by a lifetime of war and rule. And the reckoning that comes for kings as surely as for beggars, the real Domesday that no survey can measure and no oath can hold off, was drawing near for William too. Before we come to the king's own ending, let us sit for a while, quietly, with the deepest and most lasting change of all, the one that did not happen in a single battle or a single winter, but seeped slowly into the very grain of English life over the generations after 1066. And that you are, in a sense, taking part in at this very moment as you listen to these words, because the Norman conquest changed the English language itself and made it, over centuries, into the tongue we speak today. When William came, the ruling class of England spoke English, the rich, inflected Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxons and their sagas and their sermons and their laws. After the conquest, the ruling class spoke French, the language of Normandy. And for the next 200 or 300 years England was, in a strange and telling way, a country of two tongues stacked one on top of the other. At the top, in the castle and the court and the law and the counting house, French, the language of the masters. At the bottom, in the field and the cottage and the market, English, the language of the ruled, of the great mass of ordinary people who went on speaking it generation after generation, no matter what their lords spoke, so that English never died, but it went, as it were, underground, out of the halls of power, down among the people, for a long, long time, largely unwritten, changing quietly all the while. And when at last, after some 3 centuries, the two peoples had so thoroughly become one people, and English climbed back up into the court and the law and the great poems, it came back utterly transformed, having quietly swallowed thousands upon thousands of French words along the way, so that the English we speak now is a great mongrel marriage of the two, and you can hear the conquest in it every single day if you know how to listen. There is a well-known and beautiful example that you may have heard, and it is worth turning over slowly in the mind as you drift, because it holds the whole social history of 1066 in a handful of words. The living animals in the field, tended by the conquered English peasant, kept their plain old English names, so we still say cow and sheep and pig and calf, the words the herdsman used. But the meat of those same animals, once it was cooked and carried up to the table of the French-speaking lord who ate it, took on French names, and so we say beef, and mutton, and pork, and veal, the words of the man who dined, rather than the man who herded. The English kept the beast in the mud, the Norman took the meat on the plate, and 1,000 years later the language still remembers, in that small doubling, exactly who worked and who ate. It is everywhere, this layering, once you notice it, the plain short blunt words of daily life mostly English, house and home and hand and love and hate, and the longer, grander, more official words, mostly French or Latin, come in with the conquerors, government and justice and parliament and sovereign and court, so that our language carries the shape of that old division in its very bones, the ruled underneath and the rulers on top, fused now into one rich and endlessly supple tongue that is in a sense the truest and most living monument of the whole conquest, more lasting than any castle. The church, too, was remade. William and his great archbishop, an Italian scholar named Lanfranc, whom he set over the English church at Canterbury, swept away most of the English bishops and abbots and replaced them, as they had replaced the earls, with Normans and other continentals, and they reformed and reorganised the church along the lines of the wider European reform, and above all they began to rebuild it in stone, on a scale the English had never seen. All across England the modest old Anglo-Saxon churches and cathedrals were pulled down and replaced over the following decades by vast new Norman cathedrals and abbeys in the heavy, round-arched, massive style we call Romanesque, buildings of an ambition and a permanence meant to overawe, their thick walls and mighty pillars and round arches still standing today at Durham and Ely and Norwich and a dozen other places, some of the grandest buildings in England, raised by the conquerors as much to display their power and their piety as to house their prayers. Everywhere you looked in the England of William's later years, the mark of the new order was rising in stone and settling into speech, the castle on the hill, the cathedral in the town, the French words in the mouths of the mighty, the English words in the mouths of the poor, a whole civilization being pressed, slowly and not always gently, into a new shape that it has, in its deepest structures. never entirely lost. It is worth pausing here on the strange and wonderful object that has done more than any chronicle to fix the story of 1066 in the imagination of the world, because it was made in these very years within living memory of the battle by people who had seen the men and the ships with their own eyes. It is not, despite its name, truly a tapestry at all, but a great long strip of embroidery, wool thread stitched onto linen, some 70 metres long and only about half a metre high, a narrow ribbon of pictures unrolling the whole tale from beginning to end, from Harold's fateful journey to Normandy, through the oath on the relics, the death of Edward, Harold's coronation, and on to the building of the fleet, the crossing, the landing, and the long bloody day of the battle itself, all of it worked in coloured wool by patient hands, most likely English hands, in the years soon after the Conquest, probably commissioned by William's own half-brother, the warrior Bishop Odo. It is a work of propaganda, of course, telling the story firmly from the Norman side, hammering home again and again the broken oath and Harold's guilt. But it is also a work of astonishing life and detail and even humour, its borders crowded with strange beasts and little scenes and the fallen dead of the battle, its horses and ships and axes and mail shirts, giving us our clearest window into how these people actually looked and fought and lived. And there, stitched into the linen near the beginning of the campaign, above the heads of a group of pointing, staring men, is a long-tailed star, a blaze of woolen fire in the sky, and beside it, in Latin, the words that these men marvel at a star, for the makers of the tapestry, like everyone else in England that year, had seen the comet burn in the spring sky and had understood it. After the fact, as the omen it surely must have been, the sign in heaven that foretold the fall of a king, and they stitched it into the story forever, so that the same cold fire that opened our tale tonight burns still, 9 centuries later, in coloured thread on an ancient cloth in a museum in Normandy, the oldest and truest picture we have of the year the world changed. It is a strange thing to think about as you drift, that so much of what we know of that enormous year, the ships and the horses and the shield wall and the falling king, comes down to us through the patient work of a few women bent over their needles by candlelight, stitching wool into linen, inch by slow inch, month after month, setting down a story they had lived through so that we, 1,000 years later and half asleep, might still see it. The great and the terrible pass, the kings and the battles and the burning towns, and what survives, more often than not, is not the sword but the quieter thing, the embroidered cloth, the copied book, the remembered word, the small careful human labour of keeping a memory alive when the men of blood have all gone down into the dark. As for the man who won it all, William lived on for another 20 years after his crowning, and they were not easy years, for the winning of a kingdom is one thing, and the holding and passing on of it another. He grew old and famously fat, so heavy in his last years that the King of France was said to have mocked him for it, joking that William was lying in like a woman about to give birth, a jest the old conqueror would repay, as we shall see, in his last and grimmest campaign. He was troubled by his own family, above all by his eldest son Robert, a brave but feckless young man impatient to inherit Normandy and rule it in his own right, who quarrelled bitterly with his father and rose in open rebellion against him. And there is a dark and painful story that in one skirmish father and son actually met in the chaos of battle without recognising one another, and that Robert struck William down and wounded him, and only knew, when the old king cried out in his rage and pain, that he had raised his hand against his own father, a wound that never really healed between them. William spent much of his later reign back across the Channel in Normandy, defending its borders, quarrelling with the King of France, holding his sprawling cross-channel dominion together by the same restless energy and force of will that had carried him all his life. An ageing, heavy, iron-hard man who had come further from a more dangerous beginning than almost any ruler in history, and who trusted still almost no one, and who must have known, as such men come to know, that everything he had built by the sword would begin to be fought over the moment his own grip finally loosened. And in the summer of the year 1087, in a burning town on the French border, that grip at last began to fail. He had gone to war once more, over some small quarrel on the frontier between Normandy and the lands of the French king, and in his anger, remembering perhaps that jest about his fatness, he had fallen upon the town of Mantes and burned it. And it was in the streets of that burning town that his end found him, not by any enemy's sword, but by simple mischance. For as his horse picked its way through the rubble, and the embers it stumbled or shied, and the heavy old king was thrown hard against the high iron pommel of his own saddle, and something tore or ruptured deep inside his aged body, and he was carried away in terrible pain, mortally hurt. They took him back to the city of Roraine, the chief city of his beloved Normandy, and there, and later in a quiet priory on its outskirts where he was moved to escape the noise, he lay dying through the late summer weeks, in great suffering. And here, at the very end, this hardest of men seems to have been visited by something like remorse. Lying on his deathbed, the chroniclers tell us, he spoke of his life and his conquests, and he grieved, or said he grieved, for the blood he had shed, above all for the ruin he had brought upon England, confessing that he had treated the English cruelly, that he had driven them from their lands and killed them in great numbers, and that in the harrying of the north especially he had done a terrible wrong, and he professed himself afraid, now to face the judgment of God, with so much English blood upon his hands. Whether this was true repentance or the common fear of a dying age we cannot know, but it is a striking thing to find in the mouth of the conqueror at the last, the admission, from the man himself, that the making of Norman England had been a deed of blood he did not dare carry unconfessed into the dark. He tried to set his affairs in order, giving Normandy, grudgingly, to the rebellious eldest son Robert, and England, the greater prize, to his second surviving son William, called Rufus for his red face, who hurried across the channel at once to seize the throne before anyone could stop him. And then, early on a September morning in the year 1087, the old conqueror died, and in the manner of his dying and what followed, there is a strange dark final lesson about the vanity of all that grasping and holding and building, a lesson the medieval mind loved and set down without mercy. For the moment the great king breathed his last, the men around him, the lords and attendants who had been hovering for the end, did not fall to their knees in grief. Instead, the chronicle says, they leapt up and rode off in haste to secure their own property and their own futures, now that the source of all order was gone, and the lesser servants, seeing the great men gone and no one left to command them, fell to plundering the dead king's own chamber, stripping it of the arms and the plate and the very clothes and hangings, and then fled. So that for a time the body of William the Conqueror, the man who had made himself master of 2 nations, who had ordered the wealth of a whole kingdom counted down to the last pig, lay all but naked and abandoned on the floor of his own room, deserted by nearly everyone, a corpse without attendants, until at last some out of shame saw to its removal. And the indignities were not finished, for they carried him to be buried at the great abbey he had founded at Caen, and at the funeral, as the bishops and monks gathered to lay him at last in his tomb, a man stood up in the crowd and cried out that the very ground on which the church stood had been taken from his father by force, wrongfully, to build it, and that William had no right to be buried in stolen earth, so that even the conqueror's grave had to be paid for on the spot before the rite could go on, one last small debt of injustice come due at the graveside. And then, in a final grim scene that the horrified chroniclers set down in full, they found that the stone sarcophagus had been made too small for the swollen body of the fat old king, and when the attendants tried to force it in, it burst, and such a stench arose in the crowded church that the mourners fled, and the service was rushed to its end in haste. So passed William, called the Bastard, called the Conqueror, one of the most formidable men who ever lived, buried in a broken tomb in a borrowed grave, with his people running from the smell, and if you had wanted a lesson. At the close of so much striving and blood, on what all the crowns and castles and conquests come to in the end, you could hardly have asked for a plainer one than the deserted room and the bursting tomb. He had changed England more completely than any man before or since. and he went into the ground like the poorest of the peasants whose land he had taken, as a body the living could not wait to be quit of. And now, as the story settles toward its close, and the night deepens around you, let us draw slowly back from that broken tomb in Cayenne, back up and away from the single life of a single hard old man, and look one last time at the whole vast shape of what happened, and at how it reaches all the way down the long tunnel of the centuries to touch the very ground you are lying on tonight. Because that is the strange and quiet truth about 1066, the reason it is not merely one battle among the thousands that history has swallowed, but the great hinge on which the whole story of England turns. Almost everything that came after was bent by it. The kings of England for centuries afterward were the descendants of William, French-speaking, French-thinking, holding lands on both sides of the Channel, so that England and France were tangled together in a single royal family, and out of that tangle would grow, generations later, the long and terrible wars between the two crowns. The 100 Years' War and all its battles, Crecy and Poitiers and Agincourt, all of it flowing in the end from the fact that a Duke of Normandy had made himself king of England on a hill in Sussex. The language you are hearing now, the English these words are spoken in, was shaped in the crucible of the Conquest, the old Germanic tongue of the Anglo-Saxons, married for good or ill to the French of the Normans and the Latin of their church, and every time you reach for a grand word and a plain word for the same thing, every time you keep a cow but eat beef, you are speaking a small living memory of 1066 without ever thinking of it. The law grew changed, the church grew changed, the very look of the country changed, for the castles the Normans planted to hold the land down became, over the centuries, the great fortresses and then the stately homes of England, and the massive round arched cathedrals they raised still stand in a dozen cities. The oldest great buildings most English towns possess, Norman work, Conqueror's work, 900 years weathered and still standing. Even the way the country was governed, that tight, centralised, record-keeping kingdom, where the king stood above the greatest lord and knew, thanks to Domesday, what every acre held, set England on a path very different from the fractured, quarrelling patchwork of much of the continent, and shaped the slow, strange growth, many centuries later, of its parliaments and its laws. It is not too much to say that the England that went on to send its ships and its language and its quarrels and its laws out across the whole world was, in its deep foundations, an England made in the years after 1066, that the modern country and, in a sense, much of the modern English-speaking world still rests on the ground that William laid, mortared, as the old chroniclers never let us forget, with a very great deal of blood. And yet, and this is the thing to hold most gently of all as you slip towards sleep, the England that was conquered did not truly disappear. It went underneath, but it did not die. The Norman lords sat on top for a few hundred years, speaking their French in their castles, but beneath them the great mass of English people went on, in the fields and the villages, speaking their English, keeping their old words and their old ways and their old songs, being born and marrying and dying and working the same green land their ancestors had worked before ever a Norman ship touched the sand. And slowly, over the generations, so slowly that no one could point to the day it happened, the conquerors and the conquered became, simply, one people. The great-great-grandchildren of the Norman knights married the great-great-grandchildren of the English thens and the English peasants, and their children spoke English, English enriched and changed but English still, and thought of themselves not as Normans and Saxons, but as one nation, the English, and by then no one could truly say where the Norman ended and the Saxon began. For they had become the same in the blood and the same in the tongue. So the comet that burned in the spring sky, the sign that the whole country watched in fear, foretold in the end, not the destruction of England, but its transformation, the death of one England and the slow difficult birth of another out of the same soil, a harder birth than most, attended by fire and famine and the sword. But a birth nonetheless, and the country that rose from it carried both its parents in its bones, and does so still. History does not really disappear. It only sinks down, layer upon layer, and becomes the ground beneath our feet, the words in our mouths, the shape of the towns we live in, the old grey stones we walk past without a glance, and the England that fought and lost on that Sussex ridge. And the Normans who won there are both still with us, folded so deep into everything we are that we have long since stopped being able to feel the seam. And that low green ridge where it was all decided is still there too. In the Sussex countryside, quiet now, grazed by sheep, and on it stands the ruin of a great abbey that William, in one of his gestures toward heaven, ordered built on the very spot where so many died, its high altar set, the tradition says, on the exact place where King Harold fell, so that monks might pray forever for the souls of the slain. And though the abbey is a ruin now and the monks are long gone, the place is still called, plainly and simply, Battle, the town of Battle, as though the whole English language had agreed that there was only ever one battle worth the name, and the grass grows over the slope where the shield wall stood, and on a still evening you would never guess, looking at that gentle empty hillside, that here the old world ended and the new one began, that here a comet's promise was kept, that everything turned on this quiet field one afternoon in autumn 1,000 years ago. And so we come to the end of the long story, and there is nothing left in it now but sleep. So let it all sink down, gently, the comet and the ships and the shield wall and the falling arrows, the marching men and the burning towns, and the great grey castles and the old broken tomb. Let all of it settle softly into the deep still water at the bottom of the mind, where the past lies quiet, doing no one any harm, keeping no one awake. There is nothing here for you to hold on to, and nothing here for you to carry. It is all 1,000 years done, every last one of them, the kings and the warriors and the frightened villagers and the woman searching the field, all of them long asleep, and it did them no lasting harm to let go, and it will do you none either. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another quiet story waiting for you on the screen, ready to carry you a little further into the night whenever you are ready for it. And if these slow histories bring you rest, you might gently follow along. But only if they truly help you. Only if this calm corner of the dark is a place you would like to find your way back to. And if you drifted off long ago and are hearing none of this, then that is exactly as it should be. And I am glad, and you may sleep on. Let the lamp go out. Let your breath go slow and even and untroubled. In and out, and in again, softer each time. The old kings are at rest. The old wars are over and can never be fought again. The green fields of England lie quiet in the dark, and the sheep graze the ridge where the world once changed. And none of it needs you tonight. Not to remember it. Not to mourn it. Not to keep any watch over it at all. So close your eyes now and let the whole long story drift away downstream into the dark. And rest. Good night and sweet dreams.